Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. Today's topic is insulin and melatonin, two hormones which the general public has by and large heard of. Everyone knows these two hormones. So we shall have a look at the source of these hormones and why they are so important. With that, let me go to the PowerPoint. Insulin and melatonin. This course and all the activities of the YES project are a part of the celebrations of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Pancreas is a two-in-one organ. We've already seen the important role that the pancreas plays in digestion. The endocrine part occupies just 1%, just 1% of in the pancreas, but that is important. That is the part that produces insulin. So pancreas has one part that produces a juice that is conveyed by a duct to this part of the small intestine, the duodenum. The pancreas is in fact nestled in this C-shaped loop that the duodenum forms. And here is the tube that eventually conveys the juice, the pancreatic juice, digestive juice to the duodenum. That is 99% of the pancreas. But scattered throughout the pancreas are small little islets or islands. Islands, small islands, therefore islets, which have those cells which produce hormones. And there are about 1 million of these islets scattered throughout the pancreas, and they form about 1% of the pancreas. This 1% is no less important than the remaining 99%. And that's, something that tells us that we should not underestimate anyone, even if it is something small or someone humble. There's a small little couplet by Kabir which goes something like this: don't underestimate a needle, because what a needle can do, a sword can't. Here is a microscopic sort of a picture, a diagrammatic representation of the microscopic picture of the pancreas. These are the digestive glands that produce the juice that digests food, but then scattered throughout the pancreas are these islets, which have the endocrine cells that produce the hormones. The hormones, including insulin, the major hormone, which we will be talking about today, which is produced by these cells, is insulin, and the cells that produce it are called B cells, the B cells of the islets. The islets of Langerhans were first discovered by Paul Langerhans when he was just 21. And therefore, these islets, which have these endocrine cells in the pancreas, are called islets of Langerhans. Insulin was discovered by Banting and Best in 1921. The story goes something like this, that Banting, when he was about 30, was a surgeon, and that was not enough for him. He was not making a good living from surgery, and therefore, to make both ends meet, he also joined as a demonstrator in physiology. And whilst preparing for a lecture on the pancreas, he came across also an article by a surgeon which said that if you tie the duct of the pancreas, that is the tube that conveys the digestive juices to the small intestine, if you tie that, then the digestive part of the pancreas undergoes a degeneration, leaving behind only the islets. Now, this was something which struck him, and he put two and two together. Because the discovery, everybody had an idea that the pancreas produces something which prevents diabetes. This idea was there, and that this comes from the islets. That also was known, but that substance had not been isolated. That substance had not been identified. Because what would happen is that any attempt to try and get that substance from the pancreas would be unsuccessful because of the digestive enzymes of the pancreas. The 99% of the pancreas is producing those digestive enzymes, which includes protein digesting enzymes. And insulin, being a protein, would get digested by those digestive juices, and therefore one will not be able to actually get that substance from the pancreas. Now, this article that over a few weeks, the digestive part of the pancreas can degenerate if you tie that tube which goes to the small intestine, gave him an idea. Why not do an experiment in which we tie the tube, leave the animal for 6 to 8 weeks so that the digestive part degenerates and only the islets are left behind, and then use this pancreas in which the digestive part has degenerated, use that, prepare an extract, and see whether that extract contains a substance which can bring down the blood sugar. So this he was so excited by this idea that he crystallized it into a few lines. Uh, Take a dog, tie its pancreatic duct, that is the tube which conveys the digestive juice to the in small intestine, wait for 6 to 8 weeks, prepare an extract of the pancreas, inject that into an animal that has uh, been made diabetic experimentally, and see whether the blood glucose comes down. Now, he noted it down, and in many cases, this might have just stayed there. This scribbling might have stayed there somewhere and collected dust, but not in his case. He started finding out where he could do such an experiment, and he was told that such an experiment would probably be possible only in Toronto in the lab of Dr. John MacLeod. He traveled there and told him what he wanted to do. Now, in view of the large number of failures in isolating anything from the pancreas which could bring down the blood glucose, which was considered the substance that uh, helps in not getting diabetes, and something going wrong with that which leads to diabetes. Now, in view of the large number of failures which had already preceded this idea from Banting, MacLeod was extremely skeptical and discouraged him from doing any such experiments. But because of the persistence of Banting, he finally allowed him uh, 10 dogs and the use of his lab for a period of 8 weeks. And then he wanted an assistant. Banting wanted an assistant. To assist him, he asked a fourth year medical student, Charles Herbert Best, who was about 20-year-old at that time. So the two of them worked together. This 30-year-old surgeon and 20-year-old medical student, they worked together for a few weeks, and lo and behold, the experiment was successful. They found in the extract a substance which did bring down blood glucose levels, and this substance had in fact already been named, since it was already believed that this substance would be in the islets. It was called insulin. That is something which comes from these islets. So that is the story. And if this picture gives you a thrill, the way it did give me, you have a look at this. This is how it was reported, because it was a landmark discovery. Diabetes was a killer disease, incurable, and people died of diabetes soon after getting it, within a few years of getting diabetes. And therefore, to find a substance which offered hope of providing a replacement for the substance which the body produces, so that a person with diabetes could get that substance and not die, was a landmark discovery, and it was widely reported in the general press. And this is one of the newspapers of those times, 1921, with these headlines. So just exactly 100 years ago, you can say 101 years ago. Now, very few scientific discoveries are like that, in fact. The experiments were conceived in 1920. Insulin was discovered in 1921. And in 1922, a 14-year-old boy who had diabetes and was on the verge of dying received insulin and was saved. And in 1923, a Nobel Prize was awarded for this discovery. But then who got the Nobel Prize? That is interesting. The Nobel Prize was awarded to Banting and MacLeod, the surgeon who did the experiments, and the head of that laboratory or department, who allowed reluctantly the use of his laboratory for 8 weeks and a restricted supply of 10 dogs. It was he who was identified by the Nobel Prize Committee as one of those who had contributed. And completely ignored was uh, Charles Herbert Best, who had also uh, made an important contribution to this work, who had assisted Banting all along. Banting was just about 20. Maybe he didn't mind it. And he might have thought that if at such a young age he has been able to uh, come up with such a startling discovery, he'll probably make many more in the rest of his life. But then it so happened that that didn't happen. And that happens quite often in life. Just because somebody has done something at a young age doesn't mean that he'll go on repeating those miracles for the rest of his life, because there's so many things have to come together to lead to that sort of a spectacular achievement. So that never happened. However, uh, Charles Herbert Best went on to become a physiologist and wrote one of the most celebrated textbooks of physiology, commonly known as the Best and Taylor's Physiology, which survived for many decades and was considered one of the best textbooks of physiology. Banting was very hurt by the fact that the Nobel Prize Committee had not recognized the contributions of Best. He couldn't do anything about that, but he shared half the money that he got as a Nobel Prize with Best. So, and then inspired by this, what MacLeod did was to share his prize with a fourth person, Collip, who was a biochemist who helped Banting and Best with preparing good and proper extracts from the pancreas of these dogs. So actually, four people ended up getting this, uh, sharing this prize, two officially named by the Nobel Prize Committee, and two more who at least got the money because these two recognized their contribution. So this is a book by Michael Bayliss on the discovery of insulin with the signatures of the four of these persons: Banting, Best, Collip, the biochemist, and John MacLeod, whose lab it was. Now, what does insulin do in the body? It increases the utilization of glucose as fuel as well as uh, utilization by promoting storage. Now, just come to think of it, I mean, in a very simple terms, uh, if the utilization of glucose has to be increased, uh, then what are the different things that should be done? Firstly, it should become easier for different parts of the body to utilize this glucose as fuel. And glucose, in any case, is the preferred fuel for the body. And if something helps utilize that, or rather something is critical for utilizing it, that substance is available, then it is glucose that will be used. Along with that, it is also important that glucose be used for storage. And the storage form of glucose is glycogen, and that's what happens. And further, along the same lines, what should happen is that the substance which stores glucose, that is glycogen, should not break down. So the breakdown of glycogen into glucose is also prevented or inhibited by insulin. Another thing that should happen is that if on one hand glucose is being utilized, on the other hand, new glucose should not be produced. And that also happens in the body. There's a lot of interconversion of substances. Amino acids can be converted into glucose. That stops, that is inhibited by insulin. So there are four things that insulin does, all of which tend to bring down the blood glucose level, increasing the utilization as fuel, increasing the utilization uh, by way of converting it into glycogen, the storage form of carbohydrate, and reducing the breakdown of glycogen and inhibiting the formation of new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, that is from amino acids. So all these four things end up bringing down the blood glucose levels as a result of the action of insulin. So insulin brings down the blood glucose through all these mechanisms put together. But then while this is happening, insulin also affects fat and protein metabolism. It stimulates the synthesis of fat and reduces the breakdown of fat, which means that it promotes the storage of the fuel in the form of fat. Because fat is the other fuel apart from glucose, which is used by the body. And since it is promoting the use of glucose, It discourages the use of fat as fuel, promotes storage by increasing this as manufacturing of fat and reducing the breakdown of fat. Does the same thing in case of protein. It reduces the breakdown of proteins into amino acids and promotes the utilization of amino acids for forming fresh protein. In other words, you can see that it has it is affecting the metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, as well as proteins, and it has a certain sort of direction in which it is taking this metabolism. It makes sense. If we look at the overall sense of this, what is happening is that it is helping on one hand uh, the body get its preferred fuel, the glucose, and on the other hand, it is also promoting the storage both of carbohydrate and fat for lean times, say between meals or during periods of starvation. And it is also promoting the building up of the body by promoting protein synthesis and reducing the breakdown of proteins. Food has basically two functions: to serve as fuel and build the body for growth and repair. And insulin helps both these functions. It promotes the utilization of glucose as fuel and helps the body grow and repair by promoting the synthesis of uh, proteins. And it also helps in saving fat for future use. So it helps in so that fuel would be available even when the person is not eating. So both these functions of food: to serve as fuel, uh, glucose soon after a meal, and fat between meals and during starvation or fasting. And both these are being helped by the actions of insulin. So, in other words, insulin helps us make the best use of food. Now, how is blood insulin secretion regulated? How much insulin a person would produce? How is it regulated? Primarily by negative feedback, as in the case of the other hormones. And here it is not the hormone itself which feeds back, but it is mainly the effect of the hormone, that is blood glucose, and particular utilization of blood glucose that feeds back. So when the blood glucose levels are high, the insulin secretion is switched on. It brings down the blood glucose. When it starts going down below the set point, below the level which is considered optimal by the body, for which the body has set itself that, well, this is the desirable level. When it starts going below that, then insulin secretion is switched off, and the blood glucose will stay at that level. And in fact, some other hormones which raise the blood glucose will start getting secreted. So it's primarily by the effects of insulin, that is the effect of insulin on blood glucose levels, that regulates the production of insulin by negative feedback. However, some insulin is also secreted as a result of a hormone produced by the small intestine itself, by the presence of food in the small intestine. So this you can say is anticipatory control. Even before the glucose has been absorbed and has raised the blood glucose levels, the very presence of food in the small intestine, in anticipation of the rise in blood glucose that will take place, starts the switches on the insulin secretion. So some rise in the insulin levels in the blood. So some production of insulin begins even before the glucose has been absorbed, in anticipation of the glucose that will be soon absorbed from the small intestine. And for that, naturally, the best mechanism would be that the presence of food in the small intestine should itself stimulate the secretion of insulin. And what better can it be that the hormone be produced by the small intestine itself? Now, diabetes is the result of insulin deficiency. This insulin deficiency may be absolute. That is, there is not enough quantity of insulin. And that is what happens in type 1 diabetes, which has a strong genetic basis, but could be autoimmune in character, and to which some viruses may also contribute. Uh, that is what happens. The pancreas is damaged so much that it cannot produce enough insulin, and therefore there is an absolute deficiency of insulin. The deficiency of insulin may also be relative, which means there is a reasonably good supply, but the demand is higher because the person is consuming high glycemic index meals, like say a meal which has high sugar and uh, unrefined grains, refined grains from which the fiber has been removed, the husk has been removed. So refined grains and high sugar uh, meals would give a meal with a high glycemic index, that is, which pushes the blood glucose high, and the insulin may be okay for a low glycemic index meal, that is a meal consisting of unrefined grains and no sugar or low sugar. So for that, it may be enough. But if we increase the demand through the type of meals which have refined grains and high sugar, the insulin may not be enough. So it's a relative deficiency, borderline sort of a situation. Or the deficiency may be effective. There is plenty of insulin that the pancreas can make, but it is not effective because of insulin resistance. That is, the cells where insulin has to work, through insulin receptors, uh, those cells have become insensitive to the effect of insulin. So the insulin resistance, which may be because of antibodies, and some amount of insulin resistance may also be because of the modification of receptors so that the sensitivity to insulin goes down. So there may be an effective deficiency. And both these relative and effective deficiencies are what is seen in the more common variety of diabetes, that is type 2 diabetes, which is also called maturity onset diabetes because it occurs relatively late in life. Unfortunately, this disease, which generally uh, occurred only after 50, is now being seen commonly also in the 30s and 40s because of an unhealthy lifestyle. Again, type 2 diabetes does have a genetic basis. If both the parents have diabetes, then there's a 50% chance of the child also having diabetes. And if one parent has diabetes, then there's a 25% chance. So there is a genetic basis, but what the genetic basis does is to only give a tendency to develop diabetes. It does not actually give diabetes. And when this tendency will manifest, that is, express itself, depends a lot on the lifestyle. So, if the lifestyle is healthy, the person may express this genetic tendency for diabetes only at the age of 60 or 70. But if the lifestyle is unhealthy, the person may express the same tendency at the age of 30, in 30s and 40s, as is happening commonly now. So, but this is maturity onset diabetes. And here, the deficiency may be only borderline, that is a relative deficiency. If the person is eating a good diet, which is a low glycemic index, then the person may not only remain symptom free, it may be difficult to detect the diabetes even on uh, a normal sort of a test. It may become difficult. On the other hand, it may be an effective insulin deficiency because of insulin resistance, which commonly happens in overweight. If an overweight person has borderline diabetes, if this person just loses 5 kilos of weight, doesn't even bring the weight down to normal, but just loses 5 or 10 kilos of weight, this person may find that he has shifted from the borderline to the healthy category because the insulin sensitivity improves. The person becomes more sensitive to the actions of insulin. So that is type 2 or maturity onset diabetes. So essentially, diabetes mellitus is due to insulin deficiency, but this deficiency may not be always absolute. It may be only relative or effective. Now, what are the symptoms of diabetes? The person is not able to utilize the fuel, and therefore the body interprets it as if there is not enough food available. And therefore, the person feels more hungry, and the person may therefore eat more. That's called polyphagia. No, phagocytes, the cells that eat. Phagocytosis, the process of eating by the cells. So phago refers to eating. Polyphagia, that is, the person eats more because the person is more hungry, because the body interprets the non-utilization of glucose or poor utilization of glucose as a poor supply of glucose. And therefore, the person feels more hungry and eats more. Since the blood glucose levels go up, they may rise above the renal threshold, that is the threshold levels above which the kidneys cannot reabsorb enough glucose. And we saw in a previous session that that is 180 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. So when the blood glucose level is above 180, glucose appears in the urine. And since the blood glucose levels do rise when insulin is deficient, the person may have glucose in the urine, which is glucosuria. Now, pass this excessive glucose, to pass this glucose which is not getting reabsorbed, water is also required because it has to dissolve in water. And therefore, more water also stays back uh, to be passed as urine. The reabsorption of water also goes down to be able to dissolve this glucose, which is not getting absorbed. So the person passes uh, too much of urine, more urine than normal, and that is polyuria. Now, to make up for this water loss, to make up for this excessive loss of water in the urine, the person feels more thirsty and therefore drinks more water. That is polydipsia. So three polys: polyphagia, eating too much; polyuria, passing too much urine; polydipsia, drinking too much water. And then, since in spite of eating more, the person is not utilizing the food properly, the person may lose weight. Well, I mean, these are the classical symptoms of diabetes. But maturity onset diabetes may start without any symptoms. None of these symptoms may be present. It may be a rather quiet development. The person hardly knows it. And it may be detected either in a screening test, a routine testing to find out whether which is routine test, or it may be because the person got an infection, a wound, an infection which is getting difficult to uh, get rid of, a wound which is not healing properly. Uh, Now, these are some of the, or a skin disease which becomes recurrent and does not heal properly. Now, these are some of the things that can happen in a person who has diabetes. So, it may be these things, which is none of these and is not necessarily a manifestation of diabetes, but it is this type of things which may arouse the suspicion of diabetes. And then, if the test is done, if one does a blood glucose level, it may be high. Or a glucose tolerance test, that is both a fasting level and a level 2 hours after a meal. If one does that, one may find that the person actually has borderline or florid diabetes. So even in florid diabetes, sometimes there may be really no symptom at all. There is something to be conscious of because one should not wait for any of these symptoms to appear to suspect diabetes. One should, uh, at the slightest suspicion or even otherwise, routinely uh, during the routine screening tests, one can get also blood glucose done because it may one may be in for a surprise, and the sooner any disease is detected, the better it is because when it is at early stages, it's easier to treat and also reduces complications. Because complications of diabetes can be really bad, and these complications are largely preventable if we are able to maintain a reasonably good and constant blood glucose level. Then the complications can be prevented, and the complications are the loss of vision because of retinopathy, uh, renal failure because of nephropathy, and the uh, loss of sensitivity to touch, etc., in some parts of the body because of neuropathy. So these three pathies: retinopathy, nephropathy, and neuropathy. So these are the three pathies which are the complications, and they can be by and large prevented if the uh, person starts treatment early and maintains good control. That is, maintains a reasonably normal glucose level through proper management of the disease. Now, when we feel that the neuropathy should not be very disturbing because when we lose sensitivity in a part of the body, but then it's the absence of something that tells us its importance. What happens is that when the person gets hurt, the person does not feel the pain, and therefore the person neglects that injury. For example, feet are something that are quite prone to different injuries because of it's they're being subjected to all the trauma of the pressure, etc., while walking and getting hurt by a pebble or something here and there. And the result is that the person may develop an injury to the foot, which is neglected and therefore gets infected, and eventually it may lead to what is called a diabetic foot. So, not having sensitivity in some parts of the body is not just a minor inconvenience, it is also it can get serious. So, these are the major symptoms, but then none of these symptoms may be really present. Now, it's because of the high blood glucose levels, which one may feel that there's so much of glucose available, so the person should be able to use it, but because of the deficiency of insulin, the person can't use it and therefore is actually starving and therefore feels more hungry. So it's just been called starvation in the midst of plenty. Glucose everywhere, but not a grain to use, grain of sugar to use, along the same lines as that famous poem goes, water, water all around, but not a drop to drink. So that is the type of situation a diabetic has in relation to glucose. Now, treatment of diabetes is essentially a balancing act, balancing the factors which increase blood glucose with those which lower blood glucose. Because while one has to try and reach the normal glucose levels in a person with diabetes, the level should not fall below normal either. Because hypoglycemia means that less of blood glucose going everywhere, including the brain where it is critical, and therefore the person may faint because of hypoglycemia. And of course, before that, there will be some symptoms which will tell the person that he's going towards hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. So it's a balancing act. Now, what are the factors that raise the blood glucose? Food, when it's absorbed, it raises the blood glucose. Then there are hormones which oppose insulin, and there's quite a large number of them. And these hormones are raised by stress. So, stress leading to a rise in the blood glucose levels, and a sedentary life. Sedentary life because the person it takes very little exercise, and exercise itself promotes utilization of glucose. Uh, the sedentary person can have a rise in blood glucose levels. Also, because while the person is, say, uh, spending a lot of time sitting and watching the TV or looking at the phone, the person may also keep eating something, munching something, you know, and not realize how many calories he's getting in through that apparently harmless pleasure of uh, munching on some snacks. So, sedentary life also promotes an increase in the blood glucose. Now, the factors which lower blood glucose corresponding to eating, fasting, that would lower the blood glucose. Insulin lowers blood glucose, and mental relaxation also helps in lowering blood glucose in contrast with stress, and in contrast with sedentary life, exercise also helps in lowering blood glucose because the exercising muscles use up fuel, and exercise by itself helps in insulin act in those muscles and promote blood glucose. Well, I mean, this is a little comprehensive sort of way of looking at factors which raise blood glucose and lower blood glucose. But in practice, the most important factors to keep in mind are balancing the food with exercise and insulin, which means if the person has diabetes, the person should be careful to eat the food at the same time in more or less the same quantity every day in relation to the insulin or any other drug that he's taking for lowering the blood glucose. So, which means that if the person is on this treatment with insulin or an oral hypoglycemic, then the person should not miss a meal. And because missing a meal would mean that the blood glucose will start going down. On top of that, if he takes insulin or an oral hypoglycemic, it may fall below normal levels. One person may go into hypoglycemia, the first symptom of which would be excessive thirst. The person may feel weird, dizzy, and if this falls still further, the person may faint. So, to prevent that, the person should uh, balance this insulin or the oral hypoglycemics, the tablets that he's taking for lowering blood glucose, with food, which means in relation to the, so the quantity of food should be constant, and the time relationship between the food and whatever lowers blood glucose should be constant. Also, the person should take, as far as possible, the same amount of exercise at the same time. Too much of unaccustomed exertion could also lower the blood glucose. Why I'm emphasizing again and again what can lower the blood glucose is because the blood glucose going down is more life threatening than the blood glucose going up. Over the long term, yes, blood glucose should not rise very high, and that is why we have to treat diabetes. But at the same time, this is important to understand so that the person does not do those things which will lower the blood glucose without providing the compensatory amount of food. Unaccustomed exertion or fasting, or and along with that, take continuing with the insulin and the oral hypoglycemics and not balancing it with food can lower the blood glucose. So the quantity of these things, food, exercise, and the insulin or oral pills for lowering blood glucose, the quantity of these and the timing of these should stay essentially constant from day to day. Because man cannot mimic nature. Nature, does all these things on its own, uh, regulating the amount of insulin that is secreted in relation to the amount and timing of the food and the intensity and timing of exercise. The body does it automatically. But when we give insulin or a tablet from outside, the dose and the timing is fixed, and therefore these things then correspondingly have to be at a fixed time and in a fixed quantity or intensity. The person usually has to take insulin through injections which have to be self administered. So the person gradually learns how to give an insulin injection to himself or herself, and also gets accustomed to the slight pain that the prick produces. But all the same, it is an inconvenience and not a very pleasant process. Uh, and therefore, it's often asked, can insulin be given by mouth? For all practical purposes, still no. Although there are some sort of research going on how this may be possible and other alternative ways of giving insulin as compared to the injection. But all the same, for all practical purposes, still insulin cannot be given by mouth. It can be given only by an injection. Why? Because as you would have guessed, it's a protein, and therefore, if we take it through the mouth, it will get digested in the intestines. Now, which of the two is more risky? A high blood glucose or a low blood glucose? High blood sugar or a low blood sugar? Out of the two, hypoglycemia is more risky because if it falls below about 50, the brain starts getting affected because the brain can utilize only glucose as fuel. And if it goes down still further, the person might faint. With hyperglycemia, also fainting or coma can take place at very high levels. But before that reaches, generally, I mean, the person knows that the person has diabetes. So hyperglycemia is less common and also less risky. If a diabetic person misses a dose and gets hyperglycemia, that would not generally cause as much of a problem as if the person has an overdose of the drug or goes on a fast without uh, foregoing the dose of insulin or the oral hypoglycemic. This is important when one goes for a fasting blood glucose. So if a person has diabetes and has to go for a test the next morning, and after an overnight fast, the person should miss not only the morning dose of insulin or the oral hypoglycemic, which the person may be taking a little before breakfast. Not only should that be missed, but the previous night's dose should also be missed. So miss both those doses so that the person does not go into hypoglycemia, and then the person can go for a fasting blood glucose test. This would give the sort of true picture of where the person stands without taking the person to hypoglycemia because of the drug or the insulin in the absence of the food. So that's one precaution that should be taken while going for a fasting blood glucose test if the person has diabetes. So low blood glucose is more risky than high blood glucose or high blood sugar. Now, how do oral hypoglycemic agents compare with insulin? They're convenient. They can be taken orally. Uh, so one doesn't need injections. And quite a large number of uh, people who have type 2 diabetes can be managed with oral hypoglycemic agents, which is good. And they may also have some additional advantages which insulin doesn't have. Some oral hypoglycemic agents improve the sensitivity to insulin. So whatever insulin uh, reserve or insulin supply the person is still capable of, that becomes more effective because of the oral hypoglycemic agents. So these are the various advantages of oral hypoglycemic agents. However, there are some situations in which only insulin works. So firstly, I mean, the initial treatment is always started with insulin. And also, after a person has been on oral hypoglycemics for several years, the person may develop more and more of resistance to insulin. And in that situation, once again, one might have to switch to insulin. So insulin is sometimes indispensable and has to be used. Uh, Although oral hypoglycemic agents have some additional benefits as well as convenience, sometimes insulin is required even in type 2 diabetes. Type 1, of course, by and large, one requires only insulin. But type 2 also, that is the more common variety, the maturity onset diabetes, in that also sometimes insulin is required. And because uh, for type 2 diabetes, most of the time we do not require insulin, it is also sometimes called non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, or NIDDM in short. Although it is called non-insulin dependent, even in type 2 diabetes, there are situations in which insulin has to be used. Now we switch to the other hormone, melatonin, which comes from the pineal gland. Called pineal because it resembles a pine cone. The pineal, the status of the pineal has undergone many changes in history, and some of the landmarks have been Descartes calling it the seat of the soul. And he called it so because it's an unpaired organ. Most of the organs, in the body are paired: two eyes, two nostrils, two ears, the left side of the brain, the right side of the brain, and so on. But this is in the middle, near the brain, but exactly in the middle, and there's only one pineal. So he thought that since the soul cannot be divided, therefore this probably is the seat of the soul. That was his logic for calling it the seat of the soul, and this somehow in popular language it has stuck. But from the spiritual point of view, the soul does not have to be seated in the heart or in the pineal. The soul is all over because every atom, every electron, every cell in the body is a manifestation of the divine. And in that sense, if we consider the divine essence to be the soul cannot be located to a physical organ in the body. Modern science, till recently, of course, when this idea of the seat of the soul was given up, because modern science, in any case, gave up the idea of the soul itself, and therefore it did not require a seat, and therefore the soul was unseated from the body, including the pineal. But then, what about the pineal? Modern science still recently considered it to be a vestigial organ. A vestigial organ is an organ which has no function, but it has persisted because somewhere in the past, in evolution, it might have had a function. So it might have had a function in animals, like the tail. The tail is a vestigial organ in human beings. Of course, human beings don't seem to have a tail, but then remnants of the tail are there at the tip of the spine. That is the last bit of the vertebral column. There are a few fused vertebrae, which are a remnant of the vertebrae in the tail of the animals, which have a tail. So tail is a vestigial organ. Appendix in the part of the intestine. Appendix is a vestigial organ. So uh, the pineal was also considered a vestigial organ, which has persisted in human beings because somewhere in the sometime in the evolutionary past, it probably had a function in animals, but in human beings, it has no function. And therefore, since it was thought to have no function in human beings, uh, uh, textbooks of physiology did not have anything on the pineal except sometimes just a line, which, except for a line which just uh, said that pineal is a vestigial organ somewhere. Except from that, there was nothing much on the pineal. However, picture started changing after Lerner isolated melatonin in 1958 from the pineal and showed that at least it had some effect, and he called it melatonin because it reduced the formation of melanin. That is, the pigment, the color, that substance which gives color to the skin. So in some animals, melatonin uh, reduced that uh, pigmentation, reduced that color of the skin, and therefore he called it melatonin. However, this is not what it seems to do in human beings. In human beings, it has other very important functions. But then this isolation in 1958 became a sort of a landmark which led to further research on this substance and its role in human beings, its actions in human beings. And there has been enormous progress in this area from the 1960s onwards. So this is a relatively recent knowledge, the knowledge about the pineal and its hormone melatonin. Pineal is very close to the brain and it is connected to the brain, but its connection to the brain is rather devious. And the chain starts with the eyes. The eyes are exposed to light. And depending upon whether the eyes are exposed to light or darkness, whether it is day or night, the messages are correspondingly sent to the hypothalamus. That part of the brain which will keep coming up again and again because, in spite of being a small little organ at the base of the brain, it has a very wide variety of functions. So, this information about light or darkness is conveyed by the eyes to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus itself has a small little part which generates a rhythm which is circadian in nature. Circadian means approximately 24 hours. So, its activity, the activity of this part of the hypothalamus, changes in a cyclic fashion over a period of 24 hours. So, it is a sort of spontaneous generation of a circadian rhythm, and the inputs from the eyes also are circadian because the light and darkness also has a circadian rhythm because of the day and night. Now, the result is that the circadian rhythm of the hypothalamus gets aligned with the light darkness cycle, the information coming from the eyes. Now, you might say that if this is happening, then why have a circadian rhythm generator within the hypothalamus itself? The reason why that seems to be necessary is that in some cases, the inputs from the eyes may not be there, for example, in a person who is blind. Now, that person will also have at least a rough circadian rhythm because of the hypothalamus itself. It may not be as precise, uh, but all the same, that rhythm is there. And this rhythm is important because there are several rhythms in the body which have this circadian nature, and they seem to be important in contributing to our health by modulating the function over a period of 24 hours in such a way that it is in keeping with the requirements of the body, it is in keeping with what is good for the body. So the eyes send this information to the hypothalamus, that in turn sends it to the spinal cord, low down, and affects the sympathetic division of the nervous system. And then from there, it comes back to the pineal and acts on the pineal via beta receptors. Why I have mentioned the beta receptors is because beta blockers are quite commonly used for high blood pressure and in heart disease. They block the action of the neurotransmitters on beta receptors. That's why they're called beta blockers. Now, beta receptors are there not only in the heart and blood vessels, beta receptors are there also in the pineal, which means that the action of those beta blockers may not be restricted to the heart. The actions of those beta blockers may also extend to the pineal. And that would mean some side effects. Uh, Now, why this particular chain? One can say that the sympathetic nervous system gets activated during stress. And therefore, there seems to be some link in such a way that information about this stress is coupled with this information about the light and darkness, and then it reaches the pineal to modulate the activity of the pineal. So, the activity of the pineal is modulated both by day and night, light and dark cycle. It is also modulated by stress. And one may think that this has a lot of relevance because pineal produces melatonin, which as we shall see, which induces sleep. Now, while I mean falling asleep at the right time is good and desirable, and that should be regulated by the light and dark cycle. We should sleep at night, not during the day. So that makes sense. But same time, whether it is night or day, the person should not fall asleep when under stress. For example, if an animal is under uh, threat, if an animal is facing a life-threatening situation, that is not the time when the animal should fall asleep. Whether it is day or night, doesn't matter. And we find that that actually happens when we are under stress. We find that it's difficult to fall asleep, and this may be a protective mechanism in animals because an animal, when it is facing a life-threatening situation, some other bigger animal is trying to catch it. That is not the time it should be asleep, and this chain would couple the information of light and darkness with that uh, from the sympathetic nervous system, which responds to stress, and make sure that the person does not or the animal does not fall asleep. But in human beings, as you can see, because human being is the only animal which is subject to chronic stress, because human being has a well developed intellect, and therefore he tends to worry. He tends to worry about what might happen tomorrow, and he sometimes worries also what will happen 10 years later. And he also worries about what might happen to the next generation, or if given the freedom of not having to worry about the next generation, he may start thinking about what will happen 7 generations later. And he's also uh, upset about what happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago, what somebody said, what the way he was hurt. So, because of having a long memory and because of being able to see a lot into the future, because of a well developed intellect, human being is a lot more under chronic stress than animals are. And therefore, this protective response of not being able to sleep during stress can mean uh, many unhealthy effects of inadequate sleep in human beings. But all the same, one can understand why this type of a circuitous, zigzag way of the pineal getting a neural input in spite of uh, it's being close to the brain itself. So instead of a direct connection with the brain, it is coming through the brain, going to the sympathetic nerves, and then coming to the pineal. And its link with the hypothalamus and the sympathetic would ensure that it is getting all the inputs which are related to stress, because the hypothalamus funnels all the information about our thoughts and feelings, and therefore our thoughts and feelings are also in a way getting conveyed to the pineal. So you can see that this link of the pineal indicates in a way its central importance in the functioning of the body. Now, when is melatonin secreted? Because of the linkage with the eyes and the light darkness cycle, normally it is secreted at night. Now, here light has been sort of darkness has been shown roughly from 6 in the evening till 6 in the morning, and it is 12 noon and 12 noon. This is midnight. So you can see that the melatonin secretion starts going up in the evening, reaches its peak a little after midnight, and then it starts coming down. And as soon as the person is exposed to light, it comes down. And this corresponds also closely to the other, a few other rhythms, some of which have been shown here, because there are many rhythms in the body which follow this daily cycle of 24 hours. The body temperature falls at night, and physical activity also goes down at night. So one can understand that the factors which would affect the production of melatonin are the light dark cycle. This is the primary thing. But then season also has an effect, because in the northern hemisphere, and the more north we go, the more this discrepancy increases. The nights are longer in winters and than in summers. So the lengthening of the night during winters uh, would also mean more of melatonin secretion during the night, during winters. And maybe that's why in winters we tend to sleep longer. That may be one of the reasons. So it has a season also affects the melatonin secretion. Then age. As a person grows older, the capacity to form melatonin goes down. Melatonin secretion decreases, like many other faculties of the body. In general, everything declines, all bodily functions decline with age, and so does the capacity to secrete melatonin. And that may be one reason why the elderly do not sleep as well as the young people might. But then in the elderly, the sleep cycle tends to become biphasic. That is, they may feel sleepy also sometime during the day, and they find it helpful to sleep for an hour or two during the day and the rest at night. Then, corresponding to this decline in the capacity to secrete melatonin, we also find that the pineal may sometimes get calcified. It may show calcium deposits in old age, and that's how, in an X ray, in a young person, one can't see the pineal. But in an older person, one may be able to see the pineal even on an X ray. Because of the calcium deposits, it becomes opaque. Like, the bones have calcium deposits, and the bones can be seen on an X ray. In the same way, the pineal can also be sometimes seen in an old person on an X-ray because of this calcification. Then exercise, that affects melatonin. Menstruation affects melatonin. During mid-menstrual period, and the melatonin secretion goes down. And then stress levels affect melatonin secretion, as we saw. The animal should not fall asleep during stress. It's a protective response. In human beings, it may mean not being able to sleep during stressful periods. Then electrical and magnetic fields, they also reduce the production of melatonin. And this may apply also to the type of radiation that we have from our cell phones and the Wi-Fi networks. And therefore, this has again become something important. And the implications of all this are manifold. So this is the way we should be sleeping, not with the cell phone next to the bed and many other things on. As a general principle, one should sleep at the normal time, which is before 10 in the night, preferably between 9 and 10. Not only should one sleep early, but the cell phone should be away from the bedroom, and whatever electrical connections are there in the room, Wi-Fi or any other electrical, everything should be switched off at night. Now, what does melatonin do? It induces sleep. That is one of the best established effects. But it also has some very general effects which could affect health as a whole. It has an antioxidant effect and an immunostimulant effect. This antioxidant effect, that is reducing damage by the reactive oxygen species, which are an inevitable product of the process of oxidation. Fuel is used in the body through the process of oxidation. It uses oxygen the way we use oxygen for burning wood. The fuel in the body also uses oxygen. And as a result of this process of using oxygen, which is oxidation, some chemicals are produced which can damage the cells. So this is a price to be paid. But there are many antioxidant mechanisms built into the body, and also there are some antioxidants in the diet. The two put together ensure that this damage is minimized, reduced to the minimum. One of the antioxidants built into the body is melatonin. So it has an antioxidant effect, which means it would prevent this damage, which in turn would slow down aging, which in turn would improve general health. So anything which has anything to do with an antioxidant effect would in general uh, reduce the rate of aging, slow down aging, and would improve health. Immunostimulant, again, something which is very general in nature, and anything which enhances immunity would protect us from infections as well as cancer and many other diseases, which are now being seen more and more as diseases which result from chronic inflammation. subclinical chronic inflammation, and that to that, poor immunity makes an important contribution. So melatonin stimulates the enhances immunity, stimulates immunity, and thereby again has general effects, health promoting effects throughout the body. And it has some more specific effects on reproduction. And to this may be related the fact that we tend to have bright light late into the night. We tend to sleep late, and the result is that the amount of melatonin secreted at night may go down, and this may affect not only the duration and quality of our sleep, because inadequate melatonin means not even being able to sleep properly. It would affect the duration and quality of sleep. Not only that, it may also be something which is responsible for puberty developing early. In general, the age of puberty is going down. Children are becoming sexually mature at an earlier age. Girls are starting menstruation at a relatively early age. And one of the hypotheses, with some evidence, with some support, is late nights, bright light at night till quite late at night, which reduces the formation of uh, melatonin. And this is what may be responsible for that. The implications of this would be manifold. Jet lag. Now, the person is has a day-night cycle, which is established on the basis of the place from where the person starts. And in less than 24 hours, the person lands at a place where the light and dark cycle is very different. It may be entirely the opposite. It may be there may be a 12-hour difference between the place from where he started and the place where the person lands. Now, initially, it takes time for this light darkness cycle to get reestablished uh, to match the new place where the person has arrived, and that is what gives rise to this jet lag. And there are at least two ways in which this can be minimized. One is that gradually change the situation at the new place. During the day, have some darkness, and at night, sleep a little late, and so that the shift is gradual rather than sudden. Another way is in anticipation of the place where the person has to go, the person can start shifting this cycle towards what it will be where the person lands a few days before actually starting the journey. That would be anticipation. And I know people who do that, and they then find that uh, when they land somewhere, they don't have to waste of the first few days feeling sleepy during the day. So jet lag can be avoided. Another solution would be a chemical solution. Since melatonin is available, synthetic melatonin is now available, then take melatonin at night, at the night of the place where one has landed. So natural melatonin secretion may be low at night because the person is accustomed to the old light dark cycle, but we provide melatonin from outside, and that may do the trick. Then shift work. The person stays awake at night and wants to sleep during the day. So again, the solution is that at night, in any case, the place is bright because the person is working. During the daytime, make the room as dark as possible. And since it takes time for the shift to take place, one should not have, say, uh, 2 days of night shift and 2 days of day shift. Uh, what has been considered much better for the person, if the person has a night shift, continue on a night shift for 1 week, sorry, 1 month as a at a stretch or longer, uh, rather than have frequent shifts. So one may feel that night duty is an inconvenience, and therefore maybe just for 1 or 2 days in a week it may be okay. But instead, it's much better to have night duty at a stretch for a month or two, and then have day duty at a stretch for a month or two. So then the periods of transition will be simpler to negotiate, and most of the time, after the initial shift, the person will be back to the rhythm which is in keeping with the light and dark cycle of the person. Then mood disorders. Uh, we find that when a person is exposed to bright sunlight, the mood lifts up. On the other hand, when it is very cloudy for days and weeks at a stretch, as happens in some places in the world, where it is a rather gray sky most of the time, and therefore melatonin secretion is disturbed, uh, perhaps there the person can go into a depression. And therefore, for mood disorders, again, melatonin might have a significance. And immunity, poor immunity because of inadequate melatonin secretion, because of late nights, etc., would mean repeated infections, repeated attacks of common cold. It could also mean uh, a increase in the chronic inflammation in body and leading to various uh, so-called lifestyle diseases and cancer. Again, poor immunity can lead also to cancer because the immune mechanisms would not identify the cancer cells as foreign and therefore would not eliminate them. Then the process of aging again may be affected because of the antioxidant effect of melatonin. The In the absence of enough melatonin due to late nights, etc., the aging may be much faster. So, what it essentially means in practice is that our knowledge may still be incomplete. There's perhaps a lot more to learn about melatonin. It's still a growing area of knowledge, but that does give us enough indications that the time tested wisdom is getting more and more support from scientific work. That is, when to sleep, sleep early, how long to sleep, uh, matching the uh, rhythm of melatonin secretion, that is 6 to 8 hours, and how to sleep uh, free from stress, because we've seen stress and melatonin again get related. So, a restful, peaceful sleep at the right time for the right duration. The wider implications of melatonin have prompted these two writers who have written a monograph on the pineal to say, he who knows melatonin knows medicine. Suggested readings. This popular book, this of course does not have anything on the pineal. And these two textbooks, Fundamentals of Physiology and Understanding Medical Physiology. Understanding Medical Physiology does have a chapter on the pineal. Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, the place from where I'm speaking and where I stay and work, to which you are all welcome. And your questions and comments may be sent to yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there.
I had a question regarding people who have been on immunosuppressants or steroids. They are prone to be a little pre-diabetic. What is the relation? I mean, why is it that they get pre-diabetic?
Yeah, because steroids are among the hormones which raise blood glucose. And again, it is essentially a protective mechanism to mobilize all fuels in a period of stress. But then the wisdom of the body becomes a folly in case of human beings where stress tends to be chronic. So steroids do raise the blood glucose level.
Okay. And one other question, just wanted to see if you've come across such cases. Does diabetes also increase the chances of fibrosis in the liver? I mean, is that a pattern that you've seen people who have been diabetic for over a long period?
Well, I mean, all these diseases tend to be a cluster. As we saw the other day, uh, the in that article which I had mentioned probably in the previous session, uh, the focus was on uh, fatty liver itself, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And from there, the person had shown how one can explain the development of a very large variety of lifestyle diseases. Uh, One can trace probably in a similar way biochemical mechanisms starting with diabetes and leading to the other things. It's all a question of what one puts the finger on. The fact is that there is an a sort of a coordinated activity of all these parts of the body which keeps us in good health, and a disturbance at one place could disturb this whole process. Where the disease will manifest first, whether the fatty liver will manifest first, or diabetes, or hypothyroidism, or what, would depend a lot on the weak points of the body, the genetic tendency, and so on. But they tend to be a cluster, and certainly there is a relationship. One may not be able to say which is the cause and which is the effect, or which came first and which came later, but the enough linkages in the metabolism do exist to explain to some extent why they tend to be a cluster and get so why we see so much association between these diseases. The treatment uh, or prevention fortunately doesn't have to think of each of these diseases individually. When it comes to the prevention through a healthy lifestyle or management aiming at reversal through a lifestyle changes, that doesn't have to be disease specific. And one simple example, one sort of analogy one can give is that here, the principle that a separate pill for each ill doesn't apply. That is the tendency sometimes we have, that a separate treatment for every disease. But here that doesn't apply. This is more like, if you have done the laundry and you put it in the sun, if it is one piece of cloth, one garment, may take 3 hours. If you put 10, that will also take 3 hours. So you can uh, take care of all the diseases through the same type of modifications in the lifestyle. Basically, physical activity, diet, not putting into the body harmful things like uh, alcohol and tobacco, uh, and good quality sleep for the right duration at the right time, and mental peace. So these things will take care uh, of the management as well as prevention of this entire cluster.
All right, if there are no more questions, we can end today's session.